So the old saying, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you. And that kind of comes to mind as I think about this next section that we're going to look at today with Jacob. And I looked it up online. I thought, what? What did I say? Did I say it wrong? Fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Sorry, I did say it backwards. Either way, I looked it up to see, because I thought, it'd be kind of neat to have a little graphics slide to put up there. But there's really nothing good. In fact, all the stuff I found was rather tacky. There's some of those sort of demotivational things. I don't know if you've seen those, or the little e-cards that people post on their Facebook. Of all things, I'm like, that's wonderful. And there was none very nice, so I didn't grab any of those. But what I really thought about and tried desperately to locate was a montage of Charlie Brown and Lucy, where Lucy holds the football and always manages to convince Charlie Brown to come along and try to kick the football. And inevitably, she uses sweet arguments and great debate skills, and Charlie Brown talks himself into it, and then out of it, and then into it, and he ultimately runs and goes for the kick, and he continues to fall. He hasn't learned his lesson. And I thought that's kind of what Jacob is like. He's like Charlie Brown. He's this, just sort of floating along, probably a good guy at heart, but he just doesn't seem to have the backbone to stand up for himself and make any kind of decisions. And so he's been tossed around and tossed about. And first it was, his older brother. He just sort of lived in the shadow of his twin older brother, which is a weird thing to say, but it exists. And then he sort of becomes a mama's boy and lets his mom sort of kick him around and tell him what to do and push him around. And then he just seeks the approval of his dad all the time, like a little whiny baby. And so it's just kind of this weird scenario, and eventually tricks his brother because that's the only way he feels like he can get what he needs. And so he doesn't really put his faith in God a whole lot. He just kind of listens to what God has to say, even though God's promised him he'd be with him. And so finally, after he tricks Isaac into getting the blessing, he leaves. He goes on to see to the land of his father-in-law, his uncle, his grandfather and his uncle on his mom's side, and he encounters Laban and his family and meets his soon-to-be wife, Rachel. Though he agrees to work 7 years for Rachel, Laban fools him on the wedding night and trades him Leah for Rachel instead of Rachel, and he ends up marrying the wrong woman, and he's like, what have you done? And so Laban's like, it's just not the way we do it here, but you can have her other daughter too, you just have to work another 7 years. So Jacob has to work another 7 years. He gets married to two women in the matter of 2 weeks, and that's kind of disgusting or impressive depending on how you want to look at it. And so that goes on. So obviously he's learning some things about this family. It's a family, his mother was somewhat deceiving, his uncle is somewhat deceiving. He sort of has these characteristics himself, and so this whole thing is just, it's a gamesmanship. It's one-upsmanship, anyway, that whole thing where you see who can outdo the other and who can trick the other one, and it kind of becomes this terrible cycle that creates one of the most dysfunctional families I've ever seen in my entire life. And not even that it's weird that he's married to his cousin, because in those days that was kind of what you did, but it's weird that they're all so completely twisted and just messed up. So he's coming to this situation, and you think by now he would learn that Laban is just kind of a sketchy, dirty old man. He doesn't really do what he says. He doesn't promise, he doesn't follow through his promises. He looks for ways to get out of it. He follows the loopholes, or he just flat out dishonors his word, which means he is in fact just terrible. So that's kind of what Jacob is up against. And so the story we're in today is where he is, had his kids. He's gone through this thing where now his wives have argued and bickered back and forth, and basically used him to get back at each other. And now, basically now he's up to 4 wives, each of the sisters and their maidservants. So he's got 4 wives, 12 kids at this point. 11 sons and 1 daughter, and so it's just kind of a whole messed up situation. But that's where we are in this situation, and Jacob has begun to realize that maybe, just maybe, there's something more, there's a little more to it. So we're going to pick up this story, and today we're going to kind of do things a little differently. We're just going to talk through it as we go, because there's things you can learn here. The first and foremost is just that we'll come back to at the end is we've got to learn to be wise. I mean, we have to understand that there are people out there that are going to do horrible, terrible things. And so we have to be aware of that and just understand that God does not put us here to be doormats. He wants us, of course, to be His representatives, to be reflections of His glory, images. We're made in the image of God, but we are also, God is not a fool. God is very wise, and so we must learn to be wise and just discern people and to, at some point, protect ourselves and our loved ones from the harm that can come our way. And so we see that, but what happens when people do harm us? They continue to do horrible things. What do we learn? What is it that we can see and learn from this situation from Jacob and from the stories that we'd learned from him? And my little tablet is not wanting to work properly today, and so my notes keep fading out on me. I don't know what's going to happen, but we'll see. We'll just keep on going. It's a day for technology to rule the day. But here's what we learn from it is that when God is with us, because God has promised to be with Jacob, the whole story, this whole month, this whole story of Jacob reminds us that God doesn't leave us. God is always with us. The memory verse we've been working on from Genesis tells us, that God has promised to be with him, and He will not leave him until He has completed what He's promised. And so that within us, through the Holy Spirit, as we follow Christ, gives us that same presence, that same God with us. And what it tells us is God with us means that when, notice I didn't say if, but when others hurt us, we will have the ability, we can find the strength and the wisdom to forgive people and to move forward in our lives, because that's what healthy people do. Spiritually healthy people forgive and move forward. And we're going to talk about that, and that doesn't mean you set yourself up for continued disappointment. It means you use the wisdom that God gives you through those situations. You learn to forgive and then to move forward. So let's kind of take a look at the story, and we'll break it down piece at a time and talk about little bits of it. So starting at Genesis chapter 30, this is near the end at verse 25. And finally, Rachel has had her own child. It was not just her servant, but she's had her own. And so picking up at verse 25, we read, "As soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, 'Send me away, that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, that I may go, for you know that the service that I have given you.' But Laban said to him, 'If I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it.' Jacob said to him, 'You yourself know that I have served you, and you know how your livestock has fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now when shall I provide for my own household also?' And so this is Laban, said, 'What shall I give you?' And Jacob said, 'You shall not give me anything. If you will do this for me, I will again pasture your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and they shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later. When you come to look into my wages with you, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen.' Laban said, 'Good, let it be as you have said.' But that day Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, and the female goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in the charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob pastured the rest of Laban's flocks." So again, Laban proves to us that you cannot necessarily teach an old dog new tricks. He is a sketchy, greedy, foul, dirty old man. He removes the sheep and goats that he's promised to give to Jacob. Jacob says, "Let me take the ones that are generally considered less than great, speckled, spotted goats, and then the black sheep." Of course, there's a reason we use that as sort of our, what we call people. They're the ones that are not normal. They're not quite the beautiful white sheep, the normal white lambs that are there. And so Jacob gets the shaft again. And you're like, really, are you surprised? And part of me thinks, no, maybe he wasn't. We're going to read the rest of the story where we see, well, maybe he kind of already figured that out. But this proves to us that this dysfunctional family, this is where Jacob comes from himself. You've got his mother, who was also somewhat of a trickster and taught in his skills, is the same as the sister of his now father-in-law. So he should have learned this by now. And so the deceitful behavior has been passed down. And sort of a side lesson to all of this is that what we see is that what we do and teach our children will eventually get passed on. And we're going to see some more of that even further. Obviously, Jacob has learned it from his mother. Laban has learned it. It's a family trait. They see it there. What continues in our family will continue on, and we'll have to do that. I'm going to pause for just a moment and try to figure out why I'm having such issues here. There we go. Now it's working right. Got it. So anyways, we see that these things happen. Our children will repeat our mistakes. And let me tell you, unfortunately, I'm learning this more and more. I am not always the quietest when I get a little frustrated. I've tried. Sometimes I succeed. Many times I do not succeed. And so what has happened is that my boys have learned to be very loud when they get frustrated. And it is a pattern that I am working on and trying to change in myself, which is really odd because I don't know where I learned it. My parents really weren't that loud. But it's happening where I see it already. So we must be careful what we teach. The bad behaviors, the bad habits that we have, if we don't learn to change them, if we don't learn to let God shape us and change us, they're going to repeat themselves in our families. And so that's kind of an important lesson that we see here. And obviously, this cycle has continued itself. Rebecca and Laban learned it from somewhere, and they probably had the same kind of unwritten competition going on as they were kids. And now Jacob has learned it from his mom, and he and his father-in-law keep butting heads and keep trying to one-up each other and back and forth. And so it's kind of crazy. And so let's pick it up at verse 37 here. What's going to happen? Jacob has been juked. He's been fooled again. Shame on him. And what's going to happen here? Then Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the sticks. He set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, in the watering places where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the sticks, and so the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped and all the black in the flock of Laban. He put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. And whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob would lay the sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they might breed among the sticks. But for the feebler of the flock, he would not lay them there. So the feebler would be Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. And thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. I'm not really sure what large flocks has to do with female servants and male servants and camels and donkeys, but such is the way, I guess, as he increased in his own wealth, he would trade and use them for his own personal gain, as well as for taking care of Laban's flock. So he was using what he had and what he gained. But this plan, really, let's be honest, he's putting white speckled stripes on sticks and putting them in front of the animals so that when they would come to drink and would breed, because occasionally too much drinking does lead to too much other activity. What happens is with the sticks in front of them, apparently when you see that, when they would see that as the breeding process, it would cause this. So this scheme, if it was that simple, never mind. If anyway, gotta leave it alone. If we have this plan and it's obviously working, this is not a plan that Jacob came up with on his own. This can't be. Or if it is, he's doing this with the blessing of God, because, this is crazy. It doesn't work this way. There's all these things that people tell you, if you want to have a boy, you do this. If you want to have a girl, you do this. And that never works. God delivers to us what he wants us to have, in spite of what we choose to do. And so we see this, and we know that it's got to be God working with it, with him. Scripture doesn't explicitly tell us right here, this is God working. God doesn't say to Jacob, do this. We don't get that point of the story, but later we read about some things that make you wonder, well, maybe Jacob had been instructed by God on a previous occasion. But obviously, regardless of that, God is working. Either God has blessed Jacob's plan, or God has given Jacob this plan, or God and Jacob together came up with this idea, because Jacob knew at this point that Laban was going to continue to make life miserable. But in front of witnesses, Jacob has said this, and even though Laban has tried to take away all the speckled and spotted and the black sheep and the goats and all this, Jacob and God together work this plan out so that Jacob not only multiplies his own flock, but he multiplies them with the stronger, healthier animals. And Laban's flock continues to be who it is, and he would increase. So he kind of, in a twisted sort of way, is now giving a one-up on Laban. He's like, look, you can say what you want. I already knew you were going to do this, that you were going to try to jilt me again, and me and God have this plan to make sure that, I am taken care of and that my family is taken care of. And so they continue to move this. And it shouldn't surprise us at all that God works this way. This seems very odd. Sticks, striped sticks with streaks in them, that produces speckled sheep and lambs. But see, here's the kind of thing that we work out here. Let's think about the way God has worked in other stories of the Bible that we might or might not know. But God speaks through a burning bush, which doesn't actually burn up. It's just on fire but never burns up. That's odd. It goes against the laws of nature. But we're going to come to that. What about when the man named Balaam had a donkey that spoke to him and said, stop, why are you doing this? Why are you beating me? And Laban was more distressed that his donkey wasn't doing what he told him to than the fact that the donkey was talking to him. Balaam, not Laban. There was the incident where the armies of Joshua were going to defeat their enemies, and the day was running out, and Joshua prayed, and so God stopped the sun and made the day go an entire day longer. And so we see that. Jesus himself, in healing a man, decides to spit in the dirt and make mud and rub it on the guy's eyes. And aside from being a little odd and maybe unsanitary, we see that in all these situations, what has happened is something of God's creation is being taken and used in a different way than is purposed, demonstrating that God's power is greater than his creation. We have a God that is bigger than the creation that he has. We have a God that is stronger and can take what would seem to be normal situations and circumstances and work them in ways against the rationality that we have. When you plant an acorn, you get, I used to know this, an oak tree, right? It's not like you plant an acorn and you get an orange orchard, unless, of course, you happen to be given instructions by God that says, hey, I'm going to take something that I created and I'm going to demonstrate my power over my own creation. And I myself can change the situation to fit my purposes and my goals. And so once again, we see where God is doing that. And so regardless of what methodology God chooses to use or that Jacob has chosen to use in this situation that God has blessed, and in spite of Laban's trickery, once again, we see where God is working out his purposes. Jacob has been promised to be, the line will continue through him. This people that have been promised to Abraham and then Isaac, and now through him, they will be the father of many nations. And up to this point, it's just been one kid. And so Jacob, obviously, through some weird, twisted family dysfunction, and only through the grace of God, has now created a relatively, large football team for himself. And they are going to begin and become what we know as the 12 tribes. And so God is using, showing us again, the power over his own creation to serve his own purposes. And this becomes what we can learn, is that God is going to take care of us. Laban has juked and tricked and hurt Jacob over and over. But in spite of that, when we trust God in those moments, God will bring about the blessings that he has promised. Jacob inherited wealth. We may not get wealth, but there are other blessings to receive. And we'll talk about those again later on. We'll see it again. But they're there, and God is working there. And God will continue to be with us in spite of the hurt of other people. And so when we are hurt by other people, not if, but when we're hurt by other people, God with us means we're not alone through it. We do not have to suffer alone through it. And we will eventually see where Jacob learns to forgive. So let's move on and look at chapter 31, just the first few verses here. Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's, he has gained all his wealth. And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. And then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. And so Jacob's wealth begins to grow, his own prosperity. And Laban's sons get mad. I mean, they're jealous. Laban has squandered. We learned that Laban, is losing his own wealth. In spite of what Jacob has done, in spite of the fact that God has blessed Laban just to demonstrate his power and his blessing on Jacob, his sons, Laban's sons, are recognizing that Jacob is growing very wealthy. They're jealous. They begin to accuse him. we're going to be accused of things. We're going to have people lie about us. They're going to spread gossip and slander about us. That's just going to happen. That's part of how people are going to hurt us, whether they break their word like Laban has done or begin to spread lies and false gossip like Laban's sons do to Jacob. We are going to be at the mercy of people. We are never going to be exempt from sinful people. We still live in this world. Until the day we live with God in heaven, we are still going to be living in this world with people who are sinful, who are broken, and who will do things that are horrible. And what we have to trust is that God is with us, and God is going to show us. And if we listen to Him, we will find the strength to make it through those circumstances in the right time. We will find the strength to do the things that we need to take care of our families, to continue to honor and serve God, and to serve His purposes and His plans. And so what we see is where God has said, it's now time to leave. You've put up with it enough. Now it's time to go. Everything that needed to happen here has happened, and I'm done with this place. You're done with your father-in-law. You're done with all this crazy mess. It's time to get out of here. And so God takes him, and God says, I'm with you, Jacob. Remember, I'm with you. And He gives him that voice and says, now you're free. It's time to get out of here. And so Jacob tells us, we see here that God doesn't call us to return to hurtful situations. There are times that we have to endure until the end of it, but once we're done with it, once God has said it's time to move on, God is not going to call us to return to that same hurtful situation. People may continue to try to hurt us, but when God has moved us forward, it's time to learn to move forward and leave it behind. And that doesn't just mean making a change. Sometimes you have to move. Sometimes you have to change your situation, your workstation, whatever it is that you're doing. There may be a change that God has called you to, but God will call you when you have endured, you have persevered to the end of what it is that He wants you to learn, what it is that He needs to achieve through that, what it is that you're called to do. You never know who you're encountering or what impact you're having through those difficult situations. But when God says, it's time to go, we go. And we will not be called to return to that hurtful situation. God will rescue us and pull us away from it. God sent Jacob away from Laban, and so we see that. What I have struggled with in my past is learning to forgive, because you cannot truly move forward until you learn to forgive and to let it go. And sometimes learning to let it go and to forgive means recognizing people aren't going to change. Until they receive Christ, until the Holy Spirit is within them working to change them, they will not change. I'm actually starting a book right now that is a collection of letters between a father and son. The father being very skeptical of his son's Christian faith. His son is, in fact, a professor at a Christian college who teaches apologetics of all things. And after years of trying to get his dad to talk with him, he won't. So he offers a new suggestion. He sends a letter to his dad and says, Dad, let's do this through letters. That way you can say what you want to say. You don't have to worry about hurting my feelings. You can think of your questions. You can chew on what I have to say and respond in any way that you feel led. And if you're open to that, I'm open to that and would love to have this dialogue because I love you. And to me, this is the most important thing in the world. And why would I keep it from you? If you had something important, if you knew of a treasure that I could get, why would you not continue to encourage me to seek that? And so I want to have that conversation with you. And so they embark on these letters. And I've just started it, and I'm only a few letters in. But already what the son has told the father is, look, there's people in this world, and you will always have people that are evil. God gives us the capacity to choose, and with that capacity comes the potential to have great, wonderful love and care for people. But in order for that to shine, there must also be within us this great capacity to go that far away. And so as wonderful as we can also be as equally horrible if we choose so. And what he says is people eventually, if they continue so far down a certain path, they create their own character, and that will become their natural disposition because they have created. If you continue to choose sinful acts or hurtful things to other people, if you continue to be selfish and continue to choose selfishly over the years, you will become a very selfish person. And what we see is Laban isn't going to change. There is nothing within him that shows Jacob that he's going to change. There's nothing within him that shows Jacob Laban might one day come to have a relationship with God and trust God. And so he just says it's time to move on, and he learns to let go. We must ourselves learn to realize that sometimes there comes a point where we close off ourselves from people. We protect ourselves by discontinuing their ability to hurt us. And we gracefully excuse ourselves from the relationship, whatever that takes. Sometimes it means we have to part ways with a good friend. Sometimes it means we have to make tough decisions, and it's not always easy, but we are not called to continue to be hurt by people. We can continue to love those people, and there may be opportunities for us to demonstrate that love in the future, but that doesn't mean the relationship has to stay the same. And so God has called Jacob away from this relationship. And so now what we see in Jacob is he himself has actually grown up through this process. Where in the past, maybe he really didn't call on God. God always initiated, and God said, do this. And Jacob said, okay, I'll do it because, I got nothing better to do. Really, that's what it was. Jacob got sent away by his mother because his brother was trying to kill him. And so where did he go? He went where his mom told him to go. And on his way, he encountered God, and God said, I'm going to be with you. And so Jacob's like, okay, God's with me. And even though he doesn't acknowledge it a whole lot up to this point, we see that God has been with him and has blessed him and protected him from his deceitful father-in-law. And obviously right there, Jacob begins to show it when he says that the Lord has blessed Laban wherever Jacob has worked. And now, let's see what else he does. He steps it up and becomes sort of the man of the house instead of being pushed around by all his wives, which is really... Anyway, that's a whole other story we've already talked about. So let's pick it up at verse 4 and read through some more of this. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the fields where his flock was, and said to them, I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before. To which I pause and say, really? Favor? He made you work 7 years, and then he jilted you at the altar with the wrong daughter, and then he made you work 7 more years. And then, so my question is, where was the favor to begin with? So that's just kind of a funny side note. But here's what Jacob says, but the God of my father has been with me. He's beginning to recognize this. In fact, watch this whole passage, how often he cites what God has done. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. If he said the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said the stripes shall be your wages, then all the flock bore stripes. Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. In the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in a dream, Jacob, and I said, Here I am. And he said, Lift up your eyes and see. All the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do. And as we read the English Standard, when I read through the English Standard Version, some of the ancient language, much of what they would say would come as a question. Sound like a question, but it's really a rhetorical question to make the point. They're saying, is there anything left? In other words, what has our dad left for us anyway? All the money that he would have given for our dowry when it's time to go, which was the traditional thing to do, he has squandered, he's spent, there's nothing left. Anything that he would have had, God has given to you anyway. We no longer need our father. There is no reason for us to stay. And so more importantly, what they're also recognizing is now Jacob has said, we're going to do what God has said. And they recognize his independence from people for once and his dependence on God and the strength that comes from that. And they finally say, all right, if this is what God has said to you, then we're going to go. They've bickered back and forth for years. They've tried to manipulate Jacob. They've tried to push him around. They've done whatever, and he's just kind of floated around because, well, honestly, he got lots of sex out of it. But now he stepped up and said, more importantly than any of that, God has said this. God has prepared for us. Your dad tried to swap it, and God would protect us from that. And so now, seeing how God has pointed us and taken care of us, we will do what God said. And they say, that's what needs to happen. You're the man that God is speaking to. We will go with you. And so Jacob has finally kind of shaken off his mama's boy. He's grown a backbone here. And he said, this is what we're doing because God has told us. And his wives said, we understand. You're right. God has taken care of us, not our father. We are back with you. We support you. We will do whatever you tell us to do. And so let's move ahead and see what happens. And so verse 17, we pick it up. Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives on camels, and he drove away all his livestock, all his property that he had gained, and the livestock in his possession that he had acquired in Paddan Aram, to go, it sounds funny, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. And Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. And Jacob tricked Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he intended to flee. And he fled with all that he had, and arose and crossed the Euphrates, and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. And so, just when it looks like that maybe Jacob is manning up a little bit and grown a backbone and a little bit of spine, there's some lingering trickery in himself, in that he sends his whole family and begins to send them away farther and farther away from where Laban and his family was. And in fact, takes everything that is his and drives them away out of Laban's territory and back towards Canaan, where his father Isaac and where he grew up and where they are located. Rachel demonstrates to us for the first time that she has inherited this gene of just deception. And when her father is away, she goes in and she steals the idols of her father. Now, this teaches to us that when we are moving forward, there will be temptation to fall back into our old ways. Moving to an unknown sometimes can scare us, and we will be tempted to fall back in our own ways. I know that I stayed in a relationship that was actually quite miserable before I met my wonderful wife, just because it was comfortable. I had graduated college, I was living on my own, I was working at a church where there were not very many people my own age. And instead of ending a relationship that was miserable, I stayed in it because it was comfortable. And there was comfort in the familiar misery as opposed to the unfamiliar potential. And I know that's not the story that everyone has, and yet that's not a story that is completely foreign to a lot of people either. And we tend to stay in our comfortable misery because it's familiar, and let the fear of the unknown keep us from that. And what we learn from Rachel is that she is clinging to something, whether it was the paganism, whether it was because it was just something from home, or honestly, maybe it was just because she needed to steal. We don't have any idea. It doesn't tell us that, and to read into it would be irresponsible. But what we do see is that we will all be tempted to hold on to something. We will be tempted to fall back into the patterns that we have learned and the patterns that we know if we don't trust God with us to change us and obey Him to move forward. And so Jacob himself has one last trick up his sleeve. But here we don't know if Jacob's tricking Laban because that's who he's become, or if in his faith in God he realizes Laban's not going to change. And if I don't take a drastic measure, this isn't going to work out. Laban will do something again. He'll try. And so we don't know what he does, but we know that his deception is intentional. We know that it is a painful deception, because the word that we see, tricked, actually gets translated better into our English language as stole the heart of, which in those days was another way of saying that the deception ran so deep and so painful as to leave the other person at a loss for rational response. It was so hurtful that it caused the other person to lose themselves. It's the kind of pain, the kind of trickery that would drive someone to be terribly angry and react in rage, or to be so hurt that they would slip into a depression or despair where they couldn't. It was just a very painful deception. We are not always going to be responsible for the way other people react. We have to do what God tells us to do. And sometimes to excuse ourselves gracefully from a relationship is going to cause the other person pain. But if they have built years of life, if we've been hurt, if we've continued to be lied to, we can't worry about that. We have to do what it takes to get away, sometimes even to an extreme measure. Our obedience to God is more important sometimes than the feelings of other people. And I am guilty of wanting to be a schmoozer and always having the peaceful situation. And I am guilty of that. And sometimes I have to learn to step up a little more and regard what God says more than the feelings of others. I'm not saying that we should intentionally hurt people, but sometimes the situation arises where we just need to slip away quietly into that good night and not spend more time explaining ourselves, because they're not always going to get it. Moving on at verse 22. When it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsman with him and pursued him for 7 days and followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." And Laban overtook Jacob. And now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen pitched tents in the hill country of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done?
that you have tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee secretly and trick me, and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs and with tambourine and lyre? And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm, but the God of your fathers spoke to me last night, saying, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And so what we witness here is God has finally had to intervene on Jacob's behalf to Laban. Laban is so bent on going and taking his family back or whatever. We don't even know why. We don't know why he's so against Jacob. Maybe, let's not even worry about it. But Laban's dream, however, and the message that he gets from God is enough to stop him. And basically, his attitude was that he was going to teach that no good wimpy son-in-law of his to mess with him, but God steps up and says, no, you're not to say anything to him one way or the other word. In other words, you're not to do anything to him. And this is God reminding Laban of his very own words, because years back, when Abraham sent a servant into this land to find a wife for his son Isaac, Abraham's servant discovered Rebekah and her family, and came to Laban and said, I pray that God would deliver a wife for my master's son in this way, and your daughter Rebekah has been that one. And this is how God has answered my prayer. She did exactly what God said, or what I asked God for her to do. And at that point, Laban said, well, if it's what your God has done, then we can say nothing to it, because it is more powerful than our own words. And so God is using Laban's own words here against him and saying, you yourself have acknowledged that what I say must go. And so I am telling you, back off, leave him alone, let him go. And so Laban acknowledges God. And so what we see here is God is still working, and sometimes God will intervene on our behalf to the people that have hurt us, and will finally get a hold of them and let them see that they have done wrong. It's not always going to be that way, but sometimes that will happen. And what we learn is God is always bigger than the people that are hurting us and that have hurt us. God is always stronger. God's way is always better. And when God tells us to move forward, we have to move forward. We have to leave the hurt behind us, and we move forward. And the best way to do that is to learn to forgive. We skip over a situation where Jacob basically doesn't realize Rachel has stolen the idols, and Laban accuses, and of course he's like, come find it, but Rachel hides it, whether to protect Jacob or herself, we don't know. But it goes on. And so at this point, though, when Laban cannot find these things he's accused Jacob of stealing, all of Jacob's anger finally overflows, and this beautiful, he finally gets to tell Laban off. He finally gets to bring up all the years of all the hurt and pain, and he gets to explode at him. Sometimes God allows us the opportunity to speak to those who have hurt us. And I struggle with this because this doesn't seem like one of those things where God has told us we're going to love one another. But at the same time, nothing that Jacob says to Laban is a lie. Nothing that Jacob says to Laban is a personal attack. He has simply laid out the case, and what he does is he says, you continued to try to harm me, but God was looking out for me. My God is bigger than you. My God is more powerful than you. And your words, your deeds, no longer can harm me. I won't carry it with me. I refuse to let who you are and what you've done define who I am. Instead, I'm going to trust God. And that's what we must learn to do, is when we make that transition of letting what other people have done define us, and we're in that transition, and it's not always easy, and it takes time. Goodness gracious, Jacob was with Laban for 20 years. And he finally learned to move away and stop letting the man hurt him. And when we finally learn to let God move us away from those hurtful situations and to stop letting the hurt of the past define us, we find ourselves in that ability. Whether we get the chance to tell them or not, it's what Jacob is saying that's in his heart that speaks to us. I am no longer defined by the hurt of other people. I am defined by the Holy Spirit within me, God with me, moving me forward. And what we see now is at the rest of the story, there's a truce that is drawn. Laban finally agrees to leave Jacob alone. He never admits to it. He never takes responsibility for his actions. But he finally agrees to leave Jacob and his family alone. And he sets up a truce. And it's interesting because the words he uses really are still one last jab at Jacob. But what Jacob does in this grace is he finally says, I've agreed. I'm tired of letting you hurt me. I don't care what you say. What I see is that we are free from you. We are moving with God's presence and with God's power, with God's leading. We're moving to the new place where God wants us. And God is bigger than the garbage that you spew. And so even though Laban makes this truce with insult, but he still makes it, and he sets it up with witnesses this time so that he has to follow through with it, Jacob just lets him go. Because he's acknowledged, what he gets at the end is Laban's acknowledgement that they're on their own. Whether it comes with insult or not, no longer bothers him. He just says, good, it's done. And so they make this truce that no more will there be any attempt to harm either family from the other one. It's gonna, the feud dies, it's over with, they're done, they've moved on, and the relationship will never be the same. We're going to encounter people in this life that are going to hurt us. They're going to take advantage of us. When they realize we're Christians, they're going to try to appeal to our gentle spirit or our forgiving nature, and they're going to do things that are awful. And what we learn from this story is that we must trust God to give us strength to survive and to persevere until such a time as we are released and rescued from such a person. Whether it's because God says, no, you got to cut them off and you can't be friends with them, or you're going to continue to get hurt. Whether it's a situation where we're finally given the freedom to leave a job situation, whatever it is, we are going to be given that. But we must protect ourselves. We are not meant to survive or to be in a situation where we continue to get hurt and continue to open ourselves up to that sort of thing. Jesus himself tells us this in Matthew chapter 10, that we're amongst a terrible world. And he says, behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. And when they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you at that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. And so when Jacob had God with him, delivering him, giving him the words and the dreams, giving him what to say, the opportunities to speak, Jesus comes back later, years later, and repeats the same thing. You, again, will be given horrible situations, but I am with you. The Spirit himself will be with you to tell you what to say and show you what to do. And so we must be wise. We've got to protect ourselves. Learn to discern people. Treat them with love, with gentleness, but do not open yourself up for hurt any more than we have to. You can still care for someone without letting them stomp all over your feelings. And it's a tricky line, and it's tough to say because we're not supposed to close ourselves off either. But we have to be wise and be very, very precarious in these things and recognize, and I don't think I used that word correctly, but be very wise as to how we discern situations. And so the blessings that I talked about earlier that Jacob received, he received financial blessing. We may receive blessings that come to us that are not necessarily going to be financial and materialistic. What we may gain from these kind of situations, the blessings that come in the form of learned lessons that we can pass on to our kids and our friends. We may receive a growing and deeper and stronger faith in Christ. We may develop deeper wisdom and the ability to think beyond the moment and see what's going on. We may develop discernment to know people and to recognize things that are very valuable, and to see the lessons that we've learned as immeasurable but irreplaceable wisdom and blessings that God has brought our way. God forgives us every day and expects us to forgive others. Jacob eventually learned to forgive Laban for who he was. He didn't hold it against him. He walked away from it and said, you know what, this is who you are. I'm not going to hold that against you. I'm not going to let it have power over me anymore. And that's his forgiveness. And that's the same thing we do. We forgive people. We just stop letting it bother us. We learn to cancel that debt. We feel like they've taken something from us, and we say, you don't owe me anything anymore. You are who you are, and you're not going to change. But God is bigger than you. God is more powerful. And if God can forgive me, I can forgive you. And then God can move us forward. And we can become stronger, and we can learn to move forward and beyond the situations that will no longer define us. And we can allow God to demonstrate his power of being with us and changing us and shaping us through those hard times when people hurt us and do horrible things.